The NES, I just can't get enough of it. Whether the original Japanese family computer or the Western Nintendo Entertainment System, I absolutely love it. And I know I'm a British retro YouTuber, yet I'm supposed to be talking about Horace goes skiing on the Dragon 32, but that's not my thing. What is my thing? Well, I think I've established that it is very much the NES, so let's dive back into that and take a look at some modern games that push the system further than anyone might ever have thought possible. Games that maybe even outdo the original classics in significant ways. Let's start on some very solid ground with Super Mario Bros., which was, in its day, a technical marvel, Nintendo's swan song for their original cartridge hardware. First generation NES games were limited to just 40 kilobytes, not an arbitrary limit but one defined by the hardware. Nintendo didn't just have a bunch of 40k ROM carts lying around, it's kind of fundamental to how the system works. Later they expanded things, but that was the original limit, and Super Mario Bros. Packed in about as much as seemed humanly possible into that tiny space, until 2019 when Morphcat Games released Micro Mages. A very modern feeling retro platformer in the vein of Super Meat Boy, Shovel Knight or Celeste, but unlike those, this isn't just a tribute to the NES era, it is of course actually an NES game. And more than that, it runs on what's called Mapper Zero, the original cartridge hardware, so it's forced into the same 40 kilobytes as Super Mario Bros. Morphcat themselves have put a fantastic breakdown of how they achieved this on YouTube, which I will link to rather than repeat their excellent work, but the big thing to remember is the entire ROM contains only 8 kilobytes of graphics data, the original limit of the NES. That's just 512 8x8 pixel tiles in total, split evenly between backgrounds and sprites. Other games can easily have 10 times that, and yet Micro Mages gives us stunning variety across 4 unique worlds, which really do look and feel different with their own mechanics. It looks and runs so well, you might mistake it for a modern platform, but this is really 100% original NES hardware, and a brilliant demonstration of doing a lot with very little. And that's something that's always been a key part of the art of programming. Even today, it doesn't matter what hardware you've got, you always want to push it. And maybe you want to push your own mental hardware too, perhaps even into a new career, and that's where boot.dev might be able to help, the sponsor of today's video. You see, boot.dev is a platform that teaches you back-end web development from start to finish in Python, Go and JavaScript, amongst other languages. And why would you want to learn that? Well, it's a good career potentially, and maybe you just want to try something different. Boot.dev teaches you the essentials in honestly what I think is a very engaging way without getting you trapped in tutorial hell. It battles the big thing in learning something like this, boredom, with some fun gamified elements, yes, but most of all just well-designed courses that keep things moving. If you want to be a coder, you've got to code, and that's how boot.dev has you learning by actually doing the thing you need to learn how to do. I'm having a good time learning Go here, the programming language, not the board game. I do think the programming language is probably easier. It's one of the most common, most widely used programming languages today, so it is a great skill to have, and it is one of the very many nicely thought out, well designed courses on here as well, with a great progression to them. You don't need any prior coding experience or knowledge either, there's no special requirements other than an interest in the topic, and the boot.dev Discord has loads of real humans if you do need more help. So go to boot.dev and try out the courses for free, then use my code Sharopolis to get 25% off your entire first year if you choose the annual plan. So thanks boot.dev, let's get back to the video and actually let's flick back onto Micromages to ease the segue into other things. Yes, Micromages, like most NES games, is traditional 2D pixel art, and a very fine example of that it is too. Honestly, I do really recommend this game if nothing else you see here today, but that's not the only way the NES can look. A few titles have broken that mould, like Elite for example. Yes, I'm reverting to type here now as a British retro YouTuber, but it is a really fantastic example. A wireframe 3D game on the NES is certainly impressive, though the frame rate is quite low at about 10 frames per second. That is to be expected really. No 8-bit system does 3D well, the NES especially simply just wasn't built for it. Higher frame rates might just be too much to ask. Well, enter FFF. I don't quite know what's going on with the name, but this is a F-Zero remake on the NES, a genuine 3D racing game running at an insane 30 frames per second, and there's no co-processor in the cartridge, just a basic Mapper 2 chip, the same one used in classics like Contra and Mega Man. And yes, okay, there have been compromises, a lot of compromises. The view is minimal to say the least. There's no opponents, and the big thing is the resolution. It is ultra low, but that is what makes it work. Let's rewind a bit to Micromages. Again, as mentioned, NES graphics are tile-based. Each frame involves updating which 8x8 pixel tiles go where, like a mosaic. A fast and memory-efficient way of doing things, which is why the NES excels at 2D pixel art and can easily stay at max frame rate when drawing them. Elite, by contrast, has to draw new graphics for every frame and copy them into memory, which takes a while. You can't just reuse the tiles you've already got, you need to draw new ones. FFF, though, cleverly adapts the tile system for 3D. Each big and chunky pixel on the track is actually 16 normal pixels put together, and each 8x8 tile only holds 4 of these big pixels, so it's possible to hold every combination of them in the memory at once. So instead of having to redraw the screen pixel by pixel, the game just updates the name table, which is where the tile layout is stored, using those pre-drawn tiles. That layout is first built up in an off-screen RAM buffer and then uploaded to the PPU during VBlank, the short time between frames. The number of tiles you can update in this time is limited, so the sparse visuals and large blank areas help to stay within that constraint. And the result is a game that's very minimal but strikingly fast. And it's not just a tech demo, it is a real game. There might be room for more tracks, maybe some AI opponents would be nice, but what is here is fun, and it absolutely pushes the NES in a very unexpected direction. But switching gears again, pseudo 3D dungeon crawlers are another style of graphics, and one that's quite a bit more common on the NES and especially the Famicom, because this genre thrived in Japan. Games like Megami Tensei offer a first-person view, but it is all static and slow, no real sense of motion. I mean, still a good game, but very 8-bit. But a proper, smooth 3D display, surely that would be impossible. Well, cue Horror Hospital. Yes, a game doing something I never expected to see on the NES, genuine texture-mapped raycasting, running at a respectable-ish frame rate. It's billed as a demo, but it is a playable game. You explore a creepy hospital and fight monsters in turn-based RPG battles, but the standout feature, of course, is the 3D view. How does that work? Well, raycasting takes a 2D map and simulates a 3D view by sending out rays from the player's position. This little demo shows how it works. Each ray checks how far it travels before hitting a wall, and the closer the wall, the taller it appears on screen. Each ray hit draws a vertical column of pixels, and together they build a full 3D frame. Horror Hospital does this using a clever variation on the same technique as FFF. It builds a pseudo bitmap display in the name table using 8x8 tiles that represent the columns of pixels. However, instead of using 16 pixel chunks, it uses 4, meaning higher resolution but only in a narrow strip of the screen. This debugged view shows that each tile uses 4 chunky pixels at the top, with the rest of it being blank. The game's code skips drawing the blank space, only rendering that top strip, increasing the perceived resolution. The bottom part of the display, well, that's just a flipped copy of the top half. Add a decorative frame and only a slim section actually needs rendering each frame, very efficient. Still, drawing this takes work. The column heights are calculated and stored in one buffer and textures in another, then the final image is built in a third before being sent to the screen. It's not that fast, about 10 frames per second, but it's still incredibly impressive for the NES. Both FFF and Horror Hospital do remind me of some of the tricks seen on the ZX81, the low-res character-based rendering, skipping lines to build new characters, stuff that I talked about in my last video if you are interested, but let's move on from retro racing and horror dungeon hospitals to something that's maybe even more intense: bullet hell. This is Summer Carnival 92 Wrecker, one of the most revered NES shoot-em-ups, definitely a sort of proto-bullet hell game from Shinobu Yagawa, who'd later work with Rising and Cave on actual bullet hell games. Wrecker pushed the NES surely close to the absolute limits with its speed and incredible density of on-screen action. But in 2023, somehow someone took things even further with the incredible Over-Objet. Created by Japanese doujin developer Little Sound, Over-Objet gives us a very spirited attempt at full-blown bullet hell gameplay on the NES. It's packed with intricate mechanics, crazy bullet patterns and visual references to classic Danmaku shooters as they're called in Japan. And the number of bullets on screen, well, it's absolutely insane. It's clearly pushing far more sprites than any other NES game. How? Well, once again, it's about some clever programming and compromises. It is extremely flickery, even for the NES, and backgrounds are sparse to the point of not existing. There's no power-ups and no break from the hordes of enemies in space theme at all, almost like a really intense Galaga on the one hand, but on the other it is arguably the most modern feeling shooter ever made for the NES and a remarkable technical achievement. There's something clever going on here. What's it all about? Well, it's about defeating sprite limits. The NES can only handle 64 sprites total, and no more than 8 per horizontal line. Any extras just don't show up on the screen. Going back to Wrecker for a moment, this gets around the limits with a technique called temporal multiplexing. It alternates which sprites are shown each frame. This works fairly well, especially on blurry CRTs where flickering is less noticeable. In busy scenes, sprites can take turns appearing, as seen here in this paused screen going through frame by frame. But there is a point where this flickering just gets too much, so you can only go so far adding sprites like this. Over-Objet does also use this flicker trick, but it has something else up its sleeve that lets it go even further. It actually pushes more sprites by sort of overclocking the NES's graphics chip, the PPU. It puts it into overdrive. You see, normally sprite data is uploaded to the PPU at the end of each frame. In this debugged view of Wrecker, these dot patterns show that data being sent at the very end of the frame in the vertical blank. Now let's take a look at that same view with OverObj. Notice how there's two of those lines on the screen now? Yeah, when things get really busy, this game doubles the amount of sprites available by uploading them twice. You go from 64 sprites to 128, a pretty big improvement. That's why it's called OverObj, over objects. It's got more objects, more independently moving sprites than your usual NES game. No sort of special chips in the cartridge or any other sorts of enhancements required for this either. This uses the same cartridge as Super Mario Bros. 3 and many others. So why don't more games do this? Well, there is a pretty big downside. You have to stop the PPU drawing graphics to upload more data. Against a totally black background, it's not so obvious, but when the sprites are updated right in the middle of the screen, it leaves a completely empty black bar. The only backgrounds in this are those giant ships and bosses scattered throughout the level. It's actually a common trick on the NES to draw big enemies as backgrounds, but they usually never flicker or disappear. That is reserved for sprites, so here it's very noticeable that they do that too. If I do a clumsy edit of the backgrounds, those black bars become even more obvious. Yeah, you can tell why they went with a non-more black outer space backdrop. The bars are only there when they're needed, but when they are there, they move from frame to frame, making it all the more distracting. Still, I think more games might have done this technique if this restriction was the only problem with this. It was known about in the classic NES era, but its crippling flaw is that it doesn't work properly on every NES. And not just crappy clones either, but genuine, proper, licensed Nintendo hardware can sometimes struggle with this. The Nintendo seal of quality might be a bit of a joke considering all the terrible games that they gave it to, but this is the kind of thing that Nintendo did protect against. Games that just flat out won't work on some consoles. This game is brutally difficult. It is kind of what you should expect. It comes with the territory, doesn't it? But I hear that even seasoned shmup fans find this hard, and they certainly will find it flickery, but that is something that this next game avoids in both cases. Something even more impressive than OverObj? Well, in its own way, yes. The magnificent Astro Ninja Man DX. Developed by a group I think called Nikki, this came out in 2022 and it really is marvellous. A shooter with a twist. You control a single space ninja dude who powers up to a row of 5. Fire is continual and automatic, and you've only got left and right movement to worry about, and the only other thing in your arsenal being a super-ish shot with a cooldown. As much as I admire OverObj, it really did feel very punishing, but this, whilst still being challenging later on, seems to be keyed a bit more for fun rather than suffering. There aren't quite as many bullets flying around here, but there's still a ton of large objects zipping across the screen, and remarkably, flicker is minimal. Not completely gone, but noticeably way less than in OverObj. In fact, in Wrecker or really any NES shooter that you can name. So what's going on? Well, the trick is clever use of background graphics. OverObj did do this too. It is a common NES technique, as I said, to render large enemies using background tiles instead of sprites, since backgrounds don't have the same hardware limits. Doing stuff this way does have its restrictions too, but what makes Astro Ninja Man stand out is how extensively it uses this trick and how well it hides it. So let's break the game down into its two visual layers. On the left you're seeing just the background graphics, and on the right only the sprites. And right away we can see something interesting. Those giant player sprites, the ninja men at the bottom of the screen, they're not sprites at all, they're background graphics scrolling left and right as needed. Meanwhile, that twinkling star field in the background, well, that is made of sprites, not background tiles. This means it can scroll and animate independently without interfering with the larger background-based enemies. And speaking of which, yeah, you can see that that is the background again. In fact, even some of the smaller enemies are background elements too. This frees up sprite memory, making the limits much easier to avoid and helping reduce flicker dramatically. This technique though does have its trade-offs, because those background elements have to blend in. The real background has to stay fairly plain to avoid revealing the illusion. A bit more clumsy hacking with the graphics here and the trick becomes very obvious. It's much easier to spot the joins and see how it's all stitched together. But back in the normal view, it really is incredibly well executed and a brilliant example of pushing NES limitations through some smart, layered design. And it is an absolutely fabulous game all round. The music, the style, I absolutely love it, and one of the few NES games to use recognisable vocal samples in the music too. A good note to end this video on as well. To keep this manageable, I have had to sort of brutally pare this down to just 5 games, but I do know there are way more great homebrew games than this. I can easily think of another 5 off the top of my head that do interesting stuff, but if you do have any suggestions for what I might cover in another video, do let me know in the comments. So thank you again boot.dev for sponsoring this video. Head over to boot.dev and use my code Sharopolis if you do want to try it out. So thank you as ever to my patrons on Patreon. Once again, your help is definitely very much appreciated. It really does help me out, and if anyone else would like to join them, there is a link below. And I will say thank you for watching, and once again, goodbye.